The door was kicked in. Her face slammed to the floor. Cold steel cuffs snapped shut. As neighbors filmed, wide-eyed, "She's a drug queen, Ben." They said, "Drag her out like a trophy criminal." But what they didn't expect was that the woman they framed knew the law better than anyone in that courtroom. And when she stood to speak, she didn't scream. She simply said, "They silenced me with handcuffs. I answered with their empty verdict. What about your state? Where you live? Does justice stand tall or bow to power? If this is your first time here, welcome to Mr. Seven Stories. Drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from. And if you believe in truth, courage, and stories that matter, hit like, subscribe, and follow. Now, let's step into the story they try to bury, the story of Naomi Ellington. Dawson Ridge was once a jewel of the American South. Over 30 years ago, the hammering echoes of the Silverhorn steel mill still rang down the banks of the Flatwater River. People here lived by sweat, by honor, and by faith in the rule of law. But time passed. The production lines shut down. The factory was sold off to foreign corporations. And with the final clang of the last drop hammer, trust in justice began to decay. When the economy collapsed, what rose in Dawson Ridge wasn't hope, it was greed. Streets that were once clean became gathering places for shadows. Crumbling buildings turned into crime dens. But the most terrifying thing wasn't out there in the gangs. It was within the ones wearing the badge. At Dawson Ridge PD, "Protect and Serve" became just a faded slogan on patrol cars. Inside the station, power wasn't used to protect citizens. It was used to protect secrets. At the center of that underground force was Detective Frank Keegan, 47 years old, eyes cold as forged steel. Beside him stood Sergeant Blake Rowley, his loyal enforcer, infamous for mistaken arrests that always seemed to target people of color or immigrants. They didn't just manipulate the system, they devoured it. Reports were rewritten. Cameras just happened to turn off at the right moments. And those who spoke up vanished quietly from the force. There was a time when the people of Dawson Ridge still believed there were good ones in uniform. But over the years, that faith was wrung dry, as if justice in this town wasn't blindfolded with cloth, but with dollar bills. Baseless arrests increased. The court system, once a moral backbone, became a stage for scripted plays. Juries were steered, evidence tampered with, and Judge Ronald Whitlow, the man in charge at Westland Superior Court, sat high above it all, with a soul weighed down by debts and coat pockets stuffed with envelopes. Meanwhile, the local press, like the Dawson Ridge Sentinel, tried to tell the truth, but they were surrounded by pulled advertisements, anonymous threats, and a power structure that spared no one. Anyone brave enough to rise had to understand. You weren't just standing up to a crooked cop. You were going up against an entire machine, powered by fear, fabrication, and a hate passed down like family heirlooms. And in that darkness, a name began to echo in whispers. Naomi Ellington. She wasn't yet the light. But in Dawson Ridge, sometimes a single spark is enough to make an entire city tremble. Her name spread, from small-town news blurbs to church pews, from school board meetings to courthouse halls. Naomi Ellington, not because she shouted, not because she stood at a podium preaching, but because she moved quietly and never backed down. Naomi, now 33, was a daughter of Dawson Ridge. She grew up in the South Side neighborhood, where summer smelled like melting asphalt and winters cut to the bone. Her parents died in a car crash when Naomi was just 7. She was raised by her grandmother, Mavis Ellington, on Social Security checks and unshakable lessons from the Bible. Mavis once told her, "If they won't see you as human, you live in a way they can't deny your humanity." Naomi never forgot that. As a child, she saw how police spoke to white kids with soft words, and to kids like her, with shouts and fingers clamped tight around their small wrists. She once watched a classmate shoved into a patrol car for riding a bike after curfew. Naomi learned to stay silent, not out of fear, but observation. She was waiting for the right moment. She graduated valedictorian from Dawson Ridge East High School, earning a full scholarship to Franklin and Chase University, a prestigious school in Chicago known for training lawyers, investigators, and policy experts. During those years, she didn't just learn how to argue, She learned how to hold on to her values in a world where ethics wore thin. Naomi could have stayed in Chicago. She had offers from 2 major law firms. She was even invited to teach as a university fellow. She turned them all down. She came back to Dawson Ridge. People said she was crazy. Who walks away from a rising city to return to a town where justice is just a shadow? But Naomi didn't return for glory. She returned out of duty. For the kids on the South Side who were still labeled surveillance targets. For the mothers too afraid to call the police when they heard noises on the porch. For the system she once endured. Now the system she wanted to repair. Within less than a year, Naomi became a thorn in the side of Dawson Ridge PD. She filed repeated petitions against unlawful conduct. She held civil rights workshops at St. Mark's Church. She sent open letters to Westland Superior Court demanding transparency in questionable arrests. And Detective Frank Keegan took notice. He called her a nuisance. But deep down, he knew she was the greatest threat to the shadow empire he and Blake Rowley had built over 2 decades. Naomi never incited violence. But every question she asked drove a crack into the system's false silence. And in Dawson Ridge, honesty was more dangerous than any weapon. One late September evening, wind swept down from Cedar Hill, carrying the scent of ash and the last asters of the season. At Hollow Pine Tavern, an old timber bar tucked behind the abandoned industrial zone, a plot was being formed in the dark by 2 men long accustomed to surviving in darkness. Detective Frank Keegan sat silent in the corner, a glass of whiskey spinning slow in his hand, his eyes locked on the flickering fire in the hearth. Across from him sat Sergeant Blake Rowley, leather jacket wrinkled on his shoulders, his bloodshot eyes staring through the smoke. Between them lay a faded city map, red ink marking the area around 1803, Briarwood Lane, Naomi Ellington's home. "The quieter she gets, the less I sleep," Keegan muttered, his voice low, like a growl from some cave. Rowley nodded, dragging from a cigarette. "She's not like the ones who yell in parks then vanish. Naomi knows the law, knows how to flip the table." Keegan slammed his glass against the wood. "And if she keeps going, the whispers turn to inquiries. Inquiries turn to files. And files lead to that filthy stash on the 3rd floor tiles." Rowley finished, cold and even. They both knew the truth. Naomi Ellington wasn't just a nuisance. She was an existential threat. Not just because she publicly called out the police, but because she understood the system from the inside. And she had never shown fear. Keegan leaned back, his gaze sharp as a box cutter. "We can't make her disappear. The public would riot. The press would smell blood." Rowley sneered, lips curling into a crooked grin. "But if she were a criminal, everything changes." And so, a plan began to take shape. Not some sloppy ambush in a parking lot, but a calculated campaign. Plant evidence. Fabricate a narrative of interstate drug trafficking. And turn Naomi from a name respected into one despised. They'd need physical proof. White powder, even if it was just baking soda. A burner phone preloaded with fake messages. A stack of shipping invoices and falsified ledgers. Everything would lead back to one place. Naomi's apartment on Briarwood Lane. And to ensure the operation had top-down protection, Keegan knew he'd need someone on the bench. Someone willing to look the other way. Judge Ronald Whitlow, a man drowning in gambling debt. Thanks to late nights at the underground casino in the West End. A handshake, an envelope, a whispered threat. Cold enough to freeze blood. Whitlow would be key. Signing the search warrant, denying bail, and blocking Naomi from defending herself before she ever stepped into a courtroom. They clinked glasses, not in celebration, but in pact. A treaty between men willing to bend the law to protect their rotten throne. Outside the tavern, streetlights flickered. Wind howled through the trees like a distant warning. But inside the Hollow Pine Tavern, 2 silhouettes sat beneath a jaundiced glow, plotting the biggest performance Dawson Ridge had ever seen. Only one thing they didn't account for: the woman they were scheming to destroy would not let her story be written by someone else. In a 3-story red brick house at the end of Elmsworth Drive, A light still glowed from the study on the second floor, even as midnight crept past. Judge Ronald Whitlow, 58, sat at a mahogany desk, eyes sunken behind half-rimmed glasses, his hands trembling as he tried to light a cigar. But it wouldn't catch. He'd lost $17,000 in the last 3 weeks at Silver Key, a hidden casino only the elite and the morally lost dare to frequent in Dawson Ridge. And now, his creditors were done being polite. On the desk was a thick envelope, delivered that afternoon, no return address. Inside, a pre-filled search warrant with Naomi Ellington's name, a stack of large bills, and a small handwritten note, sign or lose everything. At the bottom, an owl symbol, Keegan's mark, undeniable. Whitlow rose, walked a window. In the yard, his wife was walking their dog under a dim porch light. His youngest daughter, Emily, 14, was still awake in the next room, soft music leaking from her headphones. Inside his chest, his heart raced. He'd once had a conscience. There were years he truly believed in the scales of justice. But the debts, the nights of gambling, everything, the late-night calls from predatory lenders, they had chipped away at his soul, piece by piece. Tonight, it felt like the final piece was being sold. Whitlow picked up the pen and signed, not for Keegan, not for the money, but out of fear, because he knew if he didn't, the name Whitlow wouldn't be on a courtroom door. It'd be on an obituary. The next morning at Dawson Ridge PD, Detective Keegan received a message. It's done. He smirked, glancing at Rowley. Time to make it look clean. But before they could launch the stage raid, an unexpected complication hit. One of their document forgers, a man named Dax Monroe, had just been arrested on unrelated charges in a neighboring state. From the jail, Monroe made a desperate call to Keegan, his voice raspy. Sir, if I get charged, I'll talk. I have copies of everything. I need protection. This was the variable Keegan hadn't accounted for. The guy wasn't one of their usuals. Just a one job, then gone kind of contractor. And if he talked about the forged documents, there would be fingerprints, timestamps, and worst of all, a direct link to Naomi's case. Rowley squinted. Do we take him out? Keegan shook his head. No, he's already in custody. Too risky to touch. But if he disappears now, everyone will know it's us. They had to move faster. Before Dax Monroe opened his mouth. Before someone else started connecting the red threads already beginning to cross. Keegan picked up his phone and called Judge Whitlow. Keep your composure. The first hearing is getting pushed up. Whitlow's voice was dry. I've done my part, but if this blows up... Keegan cut him off, tone sharp as a blade. Then it's not just you who loses everything. Your wife and daughter will learn what the real price of justice feels like. He hung up. In Whitlow's temple, a thin blood vessel pulsed wildly. He knew he was in too deep. What he didn't expect was that a single signature could ignite an entire city. Friday, 6:38 a.m. Dawn had barely broken over Dawson Ridge. The sky wasn't even blue yet, when a roar of surveillance helicopters shook the rooftops over Briarwood Lane. Sleek black SUVs sped in like a pack of wolves. Doors flew open. Officers in full tactical gear, faces masked in black, poured out in sync. The search warrant, signed by Judge Ronald Whitlow himself, was held up like a blade of law, though everyone knew it was rusted at the root. At 1803 Briarwood Lane, Naomi Ellington was buttoning up her shirt, getting ready to meet a journalist at the Dawson Ridge Sentinel to discuss a new series on constitutional rights. She had just reached for the coffee pot when the front door exploded off its hinges. Dawson Ridge Police. Get on the ground, hands behind your head. She didn't even have time to react. They slammed her to the floor, her cheek pressed against the cold wood, her eyes wide, locked on a shard of mirror glass beneath the sofa. A Ziploc bag of white powder was pulled from under the sink. A burner phone was found in her desk drawer, and a stack of sketchy-looking financial papers was tossed toward the camera, like props on a stage. Naomi tried to speak. I didn't do anything. This is a Mr. You have the right to remain silent. One officer interrupted, his voice flat and robotic. Anything you say can and will be used against you. Outside, neighbors gathered. Phones lit up like a swarm of tiny spotlights. An elderly woman shook her head. Naomi? That can't be. A middle-aged man sighed, arms crossed. Knew it. These folks always got something going on under the surface. Dawson Ridge PD had planned this down to the last detail. It wasn't just about arresting Naomi. It had to be public, loud, humiliating. They wanted the image burned into the town's memory of a model citizen, handcuffed in broad daylight, spread like a virus. Just hours later, it exploded across local media. Channel 6, Ridgeview News breaking report. Naomi Ellington, prominent civil rights advocate, arrested in major drug trafficking case. Aerial footage showed the helicopter circling the building, Naomi being escorted to a police SUV like a kingpin. Back at Dawson Ridge PD, Frank Keegan and Blake Rowley sat in the observation room, watching the news broadcast with cold, empty eyes. She's not a symbol anymore, Rowley said, popping a mint into his mouth. Keegan smirked. She's a headline now. At St. Mark's Church, Reverend Elijah Boone sat frozen as the news reached him. His trembling hand opened his Bible. "Dear God, this can't be real," he whispered. But doubt carved through his heart like a blade. The city began to split in two. One side believed Naomi was a victim of a setup, an enemy of a system afraid of reform. The other side whispered, "Where there's smoke, there's fire. Who gets arrested that loudly and still claims innocence?" And in the midst of the doubt, the camera flashes, the whispers, the social media chatter. Naomi Ellington was placed into the prisoner transport van. No statement, no lawyer, no community contact allowed. Only one voice pierced the chaos. Mavis Ellington, from the end of Briarwood Alley, screamed in despair. You can shackle her hands, but justice ain't dead yet. She didn't know then that those words, raw and defiant, would become the rallying cry of a movement. If your chest tightened in this moment, you're not alone. Make sure you hit subscribe to follow Naomi's journey. Because sometimes the truth only begins when every door seems closed. Inside the holding cell at Dawson Ridge PD, time didn't move, it compressed. Light from a high, narrow window cast a dull beam across cold cement, like a faded spotlight on a stage no one applauded. Naomi Ellington sat on a single iron cot, hands resting on her lap, eyes fixed on the bare brick wall ahead, not searching for answers, but to remember who she was. She hadn't seen a lawyer, hadn't been allowed to call home, hadn't even changed out of the wrinkled work clothes from her arrest in her first 36 hours. Naomi was permitted to speak exactly 3 times. Each call lasted less than 5 minutes. Each ended the same. This call has ended. But instead of breaking down, she began recalling every case she'd worked on, every federal statute she had memorized, every legal loophole the system tried to bury. As a criminal law graduate, Naomi knew one thing. Her case was too perfect. And that perfection was exactly what made it false. That night, a female officer, name unknown, just a badge marked 1421, quietly slipped a local newspaper into her cell. The front page, a photo of Naomi in handcuffs, headline in bold, "From activist to drug lord, the real Naomi Ellington?" She flipped to the biography section. The paragraph on her spotless record had been smothered with baseless speculation, rumors about suspicious ties to a nonprofit out of state. Naomi let out a dry, soundless laugh. Classic Keegan, twisting half-truths to poison the whole story. In those long, voiceless nights, Naomi began writing in her mind a case summary, timeline discrepancies in the raid, who could confirm she was home at the time. She even remembered the 4 security cameras around 1803, Briarwood Lane, and that one of them often malfunctioned, a detail Keegan might have exploited, or one that might just save her. On the morning of day 4, Jacob Marin, the court-appointed attorney, finally met with her. He was young, maybe 29, but his eyes weren't. He stepped into the interrogation room with a tired expression, holding a thin case file under one arm. "Ms. Ellington, I'm your attorney. I have to be honest, this case looks rough." Naomi nodded. "Rough is good. If it were easy, I'd already be convicted." Jacob paused for a beat, then let out a small laugh. "I read the file. Too many coincidences. Too clean. They built it to wrap you up fast." Naomi looked up. "We don't have to prove I'm innocent yet. We just need to break one link, one wrong timestamp, one contradicting entry, just enough to make the judge start asking questions." Jacob opened his notebook, flipping to the last page. "I heard a few organizations are watching this. Someone named Carmen Royce, an attorney with the Mid-South Justice Alliance, is gathering records. She might get involved." Naomi straightened up. In her chest, a faint spark flared, not the triumphant blaze of victory, but the quiet light needed to fight. Outside, the Dawson Ridge community remained divided, but small groups had begun gathering in front of City Hall, holding signs, chanting a single name, Naomi Ellington. And inside that jail cell, the woman they'd tried to silence was preparing the counterattack of her life. Friday morning, 6 days after the arrest, a light rain fell on Dawson Ridge. But outside Westland Superior Court, a crowd stood firm beneath umbrellas, raising signs that read, "Justice for Naomi. Who holds justice accountable?" Meanwhile, inside the Mid-South Justice Alliance, Carmen Royce sat locked onto a computer screen, her hair in a tight bun, her eyes focused like she was reading someone's death sentence. Before her, a series of scanned documents from an anonymous USB drive mailed to the organization. It came with one chilling line: "Naomi isn't the first." Inside the folder, internal reports from Dawson Ridge PD, arrest records from Naomi's case, and a string of images showing tampered log entries. Carmen tilted her head, then slowly typed on her phone. "Jacob, I'm in. Get ready for a full-scale cleanup." At the same time, on the third floor of Dawson Ridge PD, Officer Riley Chun, a 26-year-old rookie, barely a year out of the academy, was doing something she never expected to do, investigating her own department. She had been suspicious ever since Naomi's search warrant was rushed through in the middle of the night without any clearance from the district attorney's office. And when she was assigned to audit the system logs after the raid, she found something strange. The hallway camera on the ground floor, the one that should have captured officers entering Naomi's apartment, had been disabled exactly 7 minutes before the recording began. Coincidence? Riley whispered, but she knew, in law enforcement, coincidence was often a mask for intent. She secretly printed the log and sealed it in an envelope, sending it to Maggie Tolliver, a seasoned journalist at the Dawson Ridge Sentinel. No signature, just one line. Start with the log from September 12th. She's innocent. 3 days later, Carmen Royce officially arrived at the detention center. Naomi was mid-conference with Jacob Marin when the door to the room opened. A woman, older, firm stride, eyes sharp like a scalpel, walked in. Jacob jumped to his feet. "Carmen, we don't have time to sit and think, Jacob," she said briskly. "I need the files, seizure logs, original scene reports, everything. And I want to speak to Naomi alone." Once they were alone, Naomi looked quietly at the woman before her. "You think I was framed?" Carmen didn't answer right away. She placed a folder on the table, opened it. Inside was a grainy screenshot, a still frame of Keegan and Rowley leaving the Hollow Pine Tavern at 2:17 a.m., exactly 2 days before the raid. "You weren't just framed," Carmen said softly. "You touched a rot Dawson Ridge buried 30 years ago. And me? I specialize in dragging the dead up to the surface." Then came the earthquake. Maggie Tolliver released a leaked body cam video, footage from a reserve officer's chest rig, capturing Keegan whispering, "Place bag 4 in the kitchen cabinet." Mid-raid, Naomi hadn't even entered the frame yet. The news erupted. Channel 6 could no longer ignore it. Local Twitter feeds lit up with hashtags. Hashtag Keegan knows. Hashtag fake evidence Dawson. At the police station, Riley Chun was called into internal review. She didn't deny it. She said, "Because I saw a woman being drowned, not in water, but in power." And just like that, Naomi, though still behind bars, became the eye of a rising storm, a silent symbol of something bigger, turning into a reckoning. Monday, 8 a.m., Westland Superior Court. The air outside the courthouse was thick, like the sky was holding its breath. Reporters swarmed the steps. Microphone wires stretched like spiderwebs. Inside Courtroom 3, Naomi Ellington, 33, sat quietly between her attorney Jacob Marin and Ms. Carmen Royce. She was no longer in jail clothes. Today, she wore a deep navy blazer, pinned with a small emblem over her heart, a tilted scale of justice leaning toward the light. In front of her, Deputy District Attorney Carson Bleeker stacked documents like fortress walls. He was confident. 2 prosecution witnesses had already testified to the lawful procedures and clearly discovered evidence. But Bleeker had no idea. An earthquake was waiting for him. Carmen Royce rose, her voice clear and deliberate. "Your Honor, the defense calls Officer Riley Chun to stand." The courtroom rippled with murmurs. Keegan, seated in the gallery beside Rowley, snapped upright. Judge Ronald Whitlow gripped the armrest of his bench, his face carved in stone. Riley entered. Her uniform was crisp. Her face was not. She took the oath beneath the wooden cross, then sat in the witness chair. "Officer Chun," Carmen began, "did you personally review the data storage logs following the raid on 1803 Briarwood Lane?" "Yes," Riley replied firmly. "I was assigned to review the system logs after a camera failure was reported." "And what did you discover?" Carmen asked. "The ground floor camera was manually disabled exactly 7 minutes before the raid team entered. The system didn't glitch. Someone intervened directly." The entire courtroom held its breath. "And what about the physical evidence?" Carmen continued. "I traced the timestamp records linked to evidence bag number 4. It was logged after the final footage was recorded, meaning it wasn't even present at the scene when the camera last captured footage." Bleeker shot up from his chair. "Objection. That's speculation, subjective and unproven." Judge Whitlow struck his gavel. "Overruled. Proceed, but support with data." Carmen lifted a folder and loaded a document onto projector. The screen lit up with clear, time-stamped entries. Evidence bag number 4 was logged over 12 minutes later than the time stated in Keegan and Rowley's official report. Riley looked directly at Judge Whitlow. "I can't stay silent anymore. An innocent woman is paying the price for something I can no longer believe was coincidental." She raised her head, voice steady, addressing the whole courtroom. "When good people stay silent, justice becomes mute." Whitlow swallowed hard. He felt like the chair beneath him was sinking into the floor. From the gallery, Keegan's fists clenched so tightly, his knuckles turned white. Naomi exhaled deeply. For the first time in the entire trial, she locked eyes with Keegan. There was no challenge, no fear, just the gaze of someone who knew. Truth always finds its way to the surface. News of Riley Chen's testimony spread like wildfire through cafes, churches, and busy markets across Dawson Ridge. Hashtags trended across the state. Hashtag Riley speaks. Hashtag Naomi was framed. And in the hearts of many, a new truth was settling in. Naomi Ellington's case was no longer just about one woman. It was a blade cutting into the rotted flesh of a diseased system. Day 10 of the trial. Courtroom 3 at Westland Superior Court was packed to the walls. Police had set up barricades outside to manage the crowds flooding in from every corner of Dawson Ridge, from elders in Sable Corner to law students from Midridge University. Everyone wanted to witness the end of a case that had shaken their local justice system to its core. Inside, Carmen Royce and Jacob Marin exchanged one final glance. Before delivering the closing rebuttal, Naomi Ellington sat between them, eyes clearer than ever. She was no longer a defendant fighting destruction. She was a living witness to what an entire generation was demanding. Justice is not for sale. Carmen rose. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried enough weight to hush the entire courtroom. Your Honor, today we present a clear conclusion. The powder recovered at 1803 Briarwood Lane, per lab results from an independent facility, was not cocaine, nor any legal substance. It was baking soda, packaged, falsely labeled, and planted inside the defendant's home. She paused, then turned toward the jury. You've seen the manipulated logs. You've heard the testimony of a brave officer from within the department. And now you have scientific proof. Naomi Ellington was framed. Deputy DA Carson Bleeker tried to push back, but his voice was already fading into irrelevance. As he rose, no one listened, because every eye in the courtroom had turned toward a group that had just walked in. 3 agents from the Georgia State Office of Internal Investigation, light gray suits, polished brass badges glinting in the light. They walked straight toward the gallery, where Frank Keegan and Blake Rowley sat, frozen stiff. The lead agent pulled out an arrest warrant. Detective Frank Keegan, Sergeant Blake Rowley, you are under arrest for evidence tampering, abuse of power, and conspiracy to fabricate a criminal case. Keegan sprang to his feet, voice tight with fury. I'm a senior officer. This is a mistake. But the cold steel of handcuffs spoke louder than the law itself. Rowley didn't resist. He simply lowered his head, shoulders trembling. No one could tell, was it anger or the weight of knowing this moment was always coming. Naomi watched in silence. No smile, no gloat, just a quiet release, like wind sweeping over a wound long dried. On the bench above, Judge Ronald Whitlow had gone pale, sweat pooling behind his ears. He began to rise, inching toward the door, when one of the agents turned. We have a few questions for you as well, Judge Whitlow, concerning the warrant you signed without proper clearance. The entire room froze. Whitlow's hand tightened on the edge of his seat. He knew if he stepped down from the bench today, it wouldn't be to return as a judge. It would be to stand trial as a defendant. He let go of the chair and sat back down, as silent and hollow as a statue cracking from the inside. When the jury returned less than an hour later, they only needed 3 words. On all counts, we find the defendant, Naomi Ellington, not guilty. Applause thundered through the room. A reporter rushed forward, thrusting a mic toward her. Naomi, do you have anything you'd like to say? She paused, eyes steady, voice low but unwavering. They tried to silence me with handcuffs. I answered with their empty verdict. For a breathless moment, silence. Then the room erupted like a tidal wave. Live broadcast cut to the tear-streaked face of Mavis Ellington, standing tall, whispering through the wind as if to history itself. My girl has come home. And when Judge Ronald Whitlow exited through the courthouse's side gate, he didn't just meet federal agents. He met a quiet crowd. No shouts, no threats, just eyes fixed on him. And one question poured into silence like water into stone. Your Honor, did you sign out of fear or for power? Whitlow gave no reply. He lowered his head and walked past, as if stepping over the very honor he once swore to uphold. And at that same moment, as if to mark a chapter's end and another's beginning, the Dawson Ridge Sentinel released a special bulletin, headlined in bold, Justice System Exposed, and one woman at the eye of the storm. 3 weeks after the historic trial, Dawson Ridge was still echoing with the aftermath. Editorials flooded the front page of the Dawson Ridge Sentinel. National television featured Naomi Ellington as a symbol of a justice system reborn. But for Naomi, this wasn't an ending. It was a prologue. Frank Keegan was sentenced to 24 years in federal prison, with no parole for the first 15. Blake Rowley received a lighter sentence, 11 years. But during his appeal hearing, he unexpectedly confessed to a covert network that had operated for decades. That testimony led to the reopening of over 17 old cases, shaking the legal foundations of Dawson Ridge, and casting doubt on rulings once considered closed. Meanwhile, Judge Ronald Whitlow resigned shortly after the trial. An independent investigation was launched to examine his role in procedural violations throughout his tenure. Sources reported that he agreed to cooperate with Georgia's Judicial Integrity Commission as part of a plea deal to reduce penalties. On a quiet Monday morning, Naomi walked into the administrative wing of Dawson Ridge PD, once Frank Keegan's untouchable domain. Footsteps around her slowed, not in fear, but in respect. Pinned to her chest was a new badge: Special Investigator Naomi Ellington. By executive order from the state governor's office, Naomi was granted full oversight of internal investigations within the Dawson Ridge Police Department, including unrestricted access to case files, authority to reevaluate past prosecutions, and the power to recommend disciplinary actions against officers who had violated the public trust. The moment Naomi returned to the very building that once held her, but now to reform it, was a powerful reminder: you can be the one who makes a difference. If you believe in the power of truth and courage, hit that follow button for Mr. 7 Stories. And don't miss the next chapter in stories that move us to rise. Her first action wasn't opening case files. It was knocking on the duty office door of Officer Riley Chun. Riley stood quickly, ink still on her fingers from the incident logbook. "I didn't think you'd." Naomi smiled softly, reaching out her hand. "I came to say thank you." "I only did what was right," Riley mumbled. "In a place where everything's wrong, doing what's right takes the most courage," Naomi said. "And that courage saved me." Under Naomi's leadership, the department began a sweeping ethics overhaul: mandatory training on racial bias, clear protocols for evidence verification, and the revival of public hearings, held for the first time in 15 years, where citizens could speak and be heard. At the first hearing, Mavis Ellington sat in the front row, her eyes glowing as she watched her granddaughter take the podium. Naomi didn't speak of the past. She spoke of what lay ahead. "I didn't come back for revenge. I stayed to repair. And I believe, slowly and painfully, Dawson Ridge deserved a second chance to get it right." In the audience, Mavis looked up at her with shining eyes. As the room rose in applause, she remained seated, hand over heart, and whispered with a smile, "Justice is no longer blind. It just opened its eyes and saw my baby standing there." Someone behind her overheard, and those words, simple and raw, soon appeared on banners all across Dawson Ridge. Under the warm glow of the town hall, the applause wasn't just for Naomi, but for what she now represented: the belief that justice, even when bent, can stand tall again if someone is brave enough to hold it upright. And in the back corner of the room, taped to the old brick wall, was a black and white poster, a photo of Naomi walking out of the courthouse, head held high. Beneath it, handwritten in bold, "Justice doesn't knock. It needs someone to open the door." Naomi Ellington wasn't just vindicated. She had become the face of justice that rises. And Dawson Ridge, a town once lost, had finally found someone to lead it forward. The story of Naomi Ellington reminds us, justice doesn't just live in law books. It lives in every brave act, in every person who stands up in the dark and says, "No, I will not stay silent." If this story moved you, please like the video. Share it with someone who needs a spark of hope. Your support helps us keep telling the stories that deserve to be heard, about bravery, truth, and the long road back to light. Thank you for being part of this journey.